From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic: what should be the role of ethnic groups in U.S. foreign policy?
It has been said, perhaps quite accurately, that America is a nation of immigrants. The American people have strong ties to their relatives and ancestors in many parts of the world. So whenever a foreign policy matter crops up, American ethnic groups representing the other nations involved can usually be found lobbying for their cause. Jewish groups, for example, played a significant role in the recognition of the State of Israel. The Greek lobby had its influence on the congressional arms embargo against Turkey. More recently, black groups have begun lobbying for certain U.S. actions regarding African countries. How do we arrive at a foreign policy that best serves American national interests? How far can or should American ethnic groups be allowed to go in influencing U.S. foreign policy? Should limitations be spelled out in legislation? Is it possible that pressure from such groups could ruin an ongoing delicate country-to-country negotiation? On the other hand, are there some circumstances in which certain ethnic groups might help U.S. foreign policy framers through some informal, unofficial, non-binding talks at the citizen level? Is there a way for American foreign policy makers to take advantage of the intimate knowledge some ethnic Americans have of affairs that concern the country of their origin? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today's roundtable discussion will consider the question, what should be the role of ethnic groups in U.S. foreign policy? Appearing on today's panel are Lee Hamilton, Democratic Congressman from Indiana. Mr. Hamilton, who has served in the House of Representatives since 1965, is chairman of the Europe and Middle East Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Hamilton, who's an attorney, is vice chairman of the delegation of U.S. Congress members of the North Atlantic Assembly in Brussels. Jesse Jackson, founder and president of Operation PUSH, People United to Save Humanity. He is an ordained Baptist minister, serving as associate minister of the Fellowship Baptist Church in Chicago. Reverend Jackson headed a black delegation which contacted several Arab leaders, including Yasser Arafat, who heads the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Hyman Bookbinder is Washington representative of the American Jewish Committee. As such, he maintains a liaison between that group and members of Congress, government agencies, and foreign embassies. Mr. Bookbinder is a civil rights activist and has worked in the government's anti-poverty program. He has served as assistant director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. Eugene Rosides is senior partner in the Washington and New York City law firm of Rogers and Wells. Mr. Rosides, who has served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, is involved in Greek-American affairs. He is a founding member and chairman of the American Hellenic Institute. John Charles Daly is today's moderator. Mr. Daly is a former director of the Voice of America. He has served as a news correspondent and analyst for CBS News and for ABC News, and as vice president of the ABC network. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the gathering tensions and divisions springing from a widening and deepening ethnic and racial interest in the development and conduct of U.S. foreign policy. Our subject: what should be the role of ethnic groups in U.S. foreign policy? Electronic and physical mass communication has shrunk the world and loosened the traditional national and geographic groupings within which nations and states were formed. In the United States and elsewhere, economic, class, ethnic, peace movement, environmental, and other special interest groupings look at foreign policy issues from different perspectives and now employ the experience and skills gained in applying pressure on the administration and the Congress in domestic matters to foreign policy issues. The effectiveness and cohesion of the single-issue groupings have been refined and expanded in the civil rights, environmental, economic, Watergate, and Vietnamese crises of the last quarter of century. But equally important, the Congress, highly sensitive to special interest pressures, has in this same period vigorously asserted its authority and powers in the field of foreign policy against the White House. This has clouded the constitutional concept that the foreign policy of the United States shall be developed and conducted by the President. In this climate, voting blocs, important campaign contributions, influence in labor unions, in the business community, in the church, in the media, all available in one degree or another to the ethnic groupings, must inevitably increase their ability and their wish to influence U.S. foreign policy. Is this United States, as President Carter recently intimated, a pot of minestrone and no longer a melting pot? Are we so savagely pluralistic that it has become agonizing to define the national interest? And if we cannot define the national interest, what is to give continuity to our foreign policy? Representative Hamilton, a first question that I will pose to each member of the panel. From the perspective of the chairman of the Europe and Middle East Subcommittee of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, what do you see as the role of ethnic groups in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think ethnic groups can have a very beneficial impact on American foreign policy. After all, the ethnic influence should be natural. It's desirable in a democratic system. They represent viewpoints that need serious consideration. I tend to think that American foreign policy at times has been an elitist operation, and we need the counterbalance which ethnic groups can often give. Having said that, I think it's also important to point out that the ethnic impact on foreign policy can sometimes be negative. Care must be taken, it seems to me, when an ethnic interest is asserted, that it does not contradict other U.S. interests. And the question that all of us have to ask ourselves constantly in any foreign policy question is, what is the national interest in a given situation?
Right. Reverend Jesse Jackson, from the perspective of leadership in the black civil rights struggle and involvement in Middle East foreign policy, how do you see the role of ethnic groups?
First of all, I reiterate what the Congressman said, that our national interests must take priority over our ethnic interests. The extent to which our ethnic interests and national interests converge, all is well. The extent to which they conflict, we need to have our citizenship prioritized. I do think that we must declare that foreign policy is not for foreigners. It's for everyday people. There should be no blind spots in American affairs. The public has a right to know unclassified info, and it has an obligation to assert itself and to make its input. But it certainly at all points must be clear on the priority of citizenship, particularly around issues that we consider near and dear to us, because the one characteristic of the nation is that as a nation, its national interests must be protected in order that it might protect the interests of its citizens.
All right, Mr. Bookbinder, the same question from the perspective of Washington representative of the American Jewish Committee, who maintains liaison between the committee and agencies of the federal government, foreign embassies, and Washington representatives of other religious, civil, and human rights groups.
Well, in a way, ethnic lobbying or ethnic participation in the development of foreign policy is really no different from the kind of participation that other segments of American life participate in. There too, whether it's industry or labor or academia, the test must be, as has already been indicated, in the long run, we have to figure out what is the national interest. But there is something special about the ethnic dimension of this, because we must not forget, we cannot forget, we are still a relatively young nation, as history goes, and we are a nation of immigrants. So many of our people continue to have interest in, concern for the lands from which they come, And this is a perfectly respectable, acceptable dimension of our national life. And the test in the long run will be, what policy does the majority of the Congress or the American people support? And in arriving at that decision, we have this marketplace of ideas and requests, and we participate in it.
All right, Mr. Rosides, as a founding member and chairman of the American Hellenic Institute and special counsel to its Public Affairs Committee, which played a major role in the Greek-Turkish-Cyprus crisis, how say you?
Well, I reiterate and echo what the other panelists have said. It is a function of citizenship. I think I would add, though, that ethnic communities have a very special role to play in foreign policy, particularly. In the past, they've been kept out, and in the past, they've been literally smeared as if when they were involved in such an issue, the question was, gee, maybe they're thinking about this other country more than their own country. This is a very serious matter, and I think that Congressman Hamilton is correct when he said we've had an elitist foreign policy establishment. The policy of this country is made by the people through the Congress, and the development of foreign policy is a partnership with the Congress. I think, Mr. Daley, you mentioned about that it's supposed to be developed by the White House and conducted by the President. That's not the Constitution. The Constitution is that the policy in foreign affairs is developed by the people through the Congress. And once the policy is set by the Congress, the President carries it out. I think one of the roles that the ethnic community has to play is to correct the overbalance that this vast bureaucracy has grabbed by its monopoly of the ability to grab the facts and the headlines on foreign policy issues. And I think the community can play a very important role in helping the Congress in this area.
All right. Mr. Congressman, for more than a century, certainly since the 1860s, when Irish Americans influenced attitudes toward Great Britain, ethnic pressures have influenced U.S. foreign policy to one degree or another. Since that time, we've had the China lobby with the Jewish support for Israel, Greek activity in the Cyprus issue, Black American support of African liberation movements, the affirmative animosity of U.S. Cubans towards Castro, more recently, Black American intervention in the Middle East. In your opinion, has this long record of participation in the formulation or influencing of foreign policy done any violence to the foreign policy of the United States over the years?
Well, you make it an easy question to respond when you say, has it done any violence? I think not, probably. I'd prefer to think of it this way, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I think in many instances that I can reflect upon, the ethnic contribution has been very positive to the conduct of American foreign policy. Let me give some quick examples of that. Black Americans have surely brought to the attention of the Congress and to the President the problems in Africa. When I first came to the Congress, we couldn't get anybody to serve on the African subcommittee with Congressman Diggs. It was considered to be an out-of-the-way subcommittee. Now that's the most popular subcommittee probably in our committee. Everybody wants to get on the African subcommittee. I think the blacks in America have sensitized the Congress to the problems of Africa. Other groups have participated in that, but that's an important contribution. Our friends, our American Eastern European friends, have certainly helped us understand better the problems of human rights in the Eastern European countries. Our Jewish American friends have certainly emphasized Israeli security concerns to us, perhaps more than we would otherwise have been sensitive to. And you can just go down the list and see where the input has been helpful. Now, at the same time, I think it's fair to say that sometimes these contributions have been on the negative side and have not been helpful to us. I think, for example, of the Cuban exiles with their demand that we invade Cuba and send the Marines there to take over Cuba. I'm not sure that's been a helpful contribution to the formulation and conduct of American foreign policy. I would argue, and I'm sure my friend Mr. Bookbinder would disagree, that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was not a wise policy move, but that amendment was put in part because of the interest of the American Jewish community.
For our television viewers, would you explain the Jackson-Vanik?
Well, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment simply ties the American trade to the level of immigration from the Soviet Union. And I think in this case, and I know my friend disagrees with me, that that was not a helpful contribution. And I can mention some other things.
But Congressman, I'm glad you did. I don't want to disappoint you. So, you see, the issue, however, it seems to me that we want to discuss now is not whether it is a good policy from the Jewish point of view. If it is a bad policy, if Jackson-Vanik is bad, if it was unwise, it means the Congress acted unwisely.
That's correct. That's correct.
There can be advocacy. Every day the Congress has to make decisions. If it is a wrong decision, and at this moment I don't care to argue whether it is wrong or right, then Congress made a wrong decision. Yes. If those who wanted a different policy did not state that case effectively enough before the Congress, then it's either that they don't have a good case or they failed to make it. Then it's a challenge to them to make a better case. But as long as we have the system that we have, and decisions ultimately get made either by the Congress or by the administration, then it's not the lobbying we want to fault. We want to fault the judgment of those that made the ultimate decision.
I think you're right, and I think that is where the challenge of the integrity of Congress comes in terms of not allowing special interests to take priority over national interests. And we've found oftentimes, for example, petroleum interests taking priority over national interests and actually being in conflict with national security. And sometimes the undue influence of given ethnic groups upon a given group of Congress people has the same effect. So finally, we cannot get away from the responsibility of Congress to have courage and integrity.
Well, let me interject this, if I may. I of course agree with what you've said. The ultimate responsibility rests with the Congress and the President, and we must accept that responsibility. I do want to point out, however, that an effective ethnic group can play upon the weaknesses of the Congress in its role in developing American foreign policy. A great many congressmen, for example, tend to look at foreign policy questions as an extension of domestic politics, not on the basis of what's the national interest of the country, but what do some constituents in my district or in my state think.
But why is that kind of influence different from the influence that an oil company might apply or an agricultural bloc? It's the same principle.
It's the same principle. That's correct. But the point I'm making simply is that effective ethnic groups can often play upon the weaknesses of the Congress in persuading the Congress to take an act.
Then don't be so weak.
Well, that's a good point. I agree with that wholeheartedly, Mr. Bookbinder, but groups are very effective at this. There are many weaknesses the Congress has in the conduct of foreign policy. I've just mentioned one of them. The leadership of the Congress is not primarily interested in foreign affairs. I don't mean that as a criticism of the Congress. It's simply that the press of the congressional leadership, the press of daily business makes it quite impossible for the Speaker or the minority leader to really focus on American foreign policy questions. We have a very decentralized leadership structure in the House, and effective groups can assert their interest and play upon these weaknesses, and they do.
I'd like to pick that up a minute, Mr. Hamilton, because I want to get back to the point that I don't think it's so much the weakness of the Congress. It may be more the inadequacies of many ethnic groups in presenting their positions properly with the sole test, what is best for the United States. I want to get back to the point of the bureaucracy, the executive branch, and then that coterie of elitist members of the foreign policy establishment who have run foreign policy in this country the last 50 years. Not the people as such, and a broad-based foreign policy. I'm not saying that policy has been bad or good, but I'm saying that in this day and age, after World War II, when we became a world power, whether we liked it or not, we have to know what's going on, and the people have to become much more involved. And we cannot have a situation with a bureaucracy which is a third force. It's not elected. No matter which party is in power, the bureaucracy doesn't care. They know that 4 years later or 8, party may be out. I submit that if we had in this country, Mr. Daley, in the early 60s, 1 million Vietnamese Americans, we would never have gotten involved in the mess that we did in Vietnam.
Well, Mr. Rosides, now you played a major role in that whole Cyprus issue. Do you feel that Greek Americans, in their turn, played a major role in passing the Turkish arms embargo?
In passing it, yes, Mr. Daley. The first year, they played a substantial role based on the rule of law. We brought to the attention of each and every congressman that a fundamental law of the United States, namely that our weapons could not be used for aggression, had been violated, and Mr. Kissinger failed to enforce that law and his oath of office. The embargo was put on 6 months later after about 8 votes in the House and 8 votes in the Senate. And that embargo was held to about 6 months later on July 25, 1975. Thereafter, it was diluted very quickly, and in the remaining 3 or 4 years, the community has not been as effective because of what I'm suggesting, maybe I'm wrong on the suggestion, of utter misrepresentation of the facts and issues by the executive branch of government as to what is the issue in Cyprus, what are the facts of involvement there, and what are the strategic interests of the United States in listening posts in Turkey. These are factual issues and issues of judgment. And you never had a proper attempt to debate this in the press because the bureaucracy had overriding control. Particularly, it's an added problem when the foreign policy issue involves not just the State Department, but the military and the Department of Defense. So,
I'm about to say, to me, what the ethnic influence again becomes a factor, and it's relative to the organization of the domestic group. Because of domestic political power, it still falls upon the executive branch to enforce a law and become consistent. You see in the real sense what's happening with Lebanon. Lebanon is really being violated by essentially where we've made a move on Turkey. We've not made the same move on Israel based upon our own internal political arrangement. It is more expedient to move where there perhaps is less organization than where there is more organization. So when it's all said and done, it still comes back, one, to how the press will project it. Because oftentimes the press helps to determine our mindset by distorted news or deleted news. Because often our free press, in these instances, does not become a fair press. And that affects the public view. The other part becomes, is it politically expedient for a given executive to enforce a given law? And the law is no better than its enforcement.
I anticipated you'd like to
No,
say that.
I'm not going to talk about Lebanon, not for the moment anyway. I just want to sort of broaden our look right now to make the point that when we use the word lobby and we talk about ethnic influence, we ought not to think of it in the narrow sense of trying to persuade members of the Congress. When it's a legislative matter, that is the ultimate step. But what we're talking about is influencing public opinion, influencing the American people to be supportive of one policy or another policy. And with all the shortcomings, with all the complaints that I can add to the list of how our system is not working, I want to say for a moment that I delight in the fact that we do have essentially a responsive system. That if we have any problem, it's that some groups, whether they be ethnic groups or economic groups or geographic groups, have not yet learned the lesson of how to make their case. When the case...
Bookbinder, I would concur in that, but and I think it's important to understand the only reason for that is our Constitution. You could not have this in a parliamentary system of government. You don't have it in Britain. You don't have it in some of the European countries. You have it because of the uniqueness of the Congress and the separation of powers and the crucial power of the Congress.
And the right to petition.
And the right to petition, but Congress's role in the separation of powers and in formulating foreign policy.
Mr. Rosides, may I make this observation? I agree with what you said. It strikes me that it's no accident that the American Enterprise Institute picks this topic at a time when you're in the activist phase by the Congress in the conduct of foreign policy. This question would not have occurred to anybody in the period before the Congress really got active in foreign policy.
Now may I take up Lebanon to make, not because I want to argue Lebanon as such, but to help make another point about the issue that we're discussing here. Reverend Jackson implies in what he says that America might have made a different decision. The administration might have done something different in Lebanon if they weren't scared of those Jews who will complain if they do something. That's the clear implication. I suggest that that's a rather crude oversimplification of how the system works and how every one of our recent administrations has acted. If they've taken a certain position on Lebanon or any other aspect of the Middle East, it's because, correctly or not, they have determined that that's the policy which is likely to go with a Congress, with a people, and so on. Now, once in a while, they'll take a position that seems to resist the popular will because they think it is overwhelmingly right. But I want to suggest now, and if time allows for a substantive discussion of the Middle East issue, I'll be happy to participate in it.
That's not what we're here for.
I know, but I want to suggest, nevertheless, that the basic Middle East policies of our government, as it has been of every administration in the last 30 years, is based on the simple premise that strong support for the security of Israel is in the interest of the United States. Now, we can quarrel about a detail here and there, but that's the basic premise. And only as long as we can keep the American people believing that, will the so-called Jewish lobby seem to have its way. But once the American people don't support it, that's it.
I suggest to you that if it were a more dominant ethnic group where the competition for power existed, that the use of American weapons in Lebanon, the extent to which they have been used, would have been protested, would have been stopped. There are just literally too few politically active Arab Americans to, in fact, counterbalance that policy. If that were American weapons being used to that extent in Africa, the rage in American blacks would have neutralized that policy in a greater measure, which means that once we use ethnic politics, those who are the strongest, most organized, most vocal tend to have their will. Those that are the smallest may not. And that comes to the whole question of the integrity and the strength of the executive office, in fact. Because on this arrangement, it becomes, kind of Darwinian, the survival of the fittest, and the biggest lion in the jungle devours everybody. And therefore, I think that when we set certain precedents, then we do in fact jeopardize national security. Because my very position is that this whole idea of preemptive strikes in the name of security, we could preempt move on Cuba because Russia has troops there, or justify South Africa moving north. I think it's very dangerous, and I think that that would not be allowed to happen if there were a counterbalancing political force.
Reverend Jackson, you were there more recently than I was, but I would hope that you would reconsider the words you've just used to call what you call preventive strikes in a situation that is clearly a case of a country defending itself against terrorist raids against children and women in marketplaces. And if you cannot see the distinction between those two things, and with one broad brush want to make it seem like it's the kind of crime that the PLO is engaging in, then I'm afraid we won't have any basis for a constructive dialogue.
That's not quite what I mean. No. See, what I am suggesting...
It isn't as clear a violation of the law, I'm saying, as you suggest.
I guess
Mr. Bookbinder and Reverend Mr. Jackson, I made a point earlier, this is not a discussion of the Middle East imbroglio, which would take another 45 days, probably all of its own. Yes, Mr. Congressman.
Chairman, let me make this observation. I think it's worth asking the question, why does the Congress become exercised about the rule of law in a case like Cyprus or Lebanon, to a much lesser degree, when we don't get exercised about the Moroccan situation, where the question is the possible use of American arms for aggressive purposes also, or I think there are some 20 other instances which the Library of Congress has put together for us. Why is it we get exercised on one or two instances? Now, there are probably a lot of answers to that question, but one reason is because a group in the society has been effective in making the point with the United States Congress. They've done what you've referred to as, and I think Mr. Rosides, as an effective exercise of citizenship.
To what extent do you think that issues contained in foreign policy debates are in reality a proxy for conflicts over domestic issues and the distribution of domestic benefits. Would you like to talk to that, Reverend Jackson?
Well, I just clearly think that the first reason we ought to be involved in the affairs of America's foreign policy is that we are American citizens and must determine what represents enhancement to our security and what is a threat. And therefore, I think our foreign affairs participation should not be limited to our ethnic concerns, because sometimes they are economic concerns, they are moral concerns, they are issues of war and peace. And to that extent, we should not limit ourselves, it seems to me, to areas that directly are traceable to our own heritage, because I think it weakens our moral authority and takes away the credibility. It weakens the position that you're doing it because it's in the national interest. It becomes clearly your own selfish interest, not just self-interest, but selfish interest.
I think, can I add?
Please do.
I think that's consistent with your question. It's a mistake to think that ethnic groups, I know I can speak on behalf of the Jewish community here, but it's true of other communities too, that our foreign interests, our foreign policy interests, are limited to what are considered parochial ethnic interests. I've spent a lot of time in recent weeks on the whole issue of the southeastern refugee situation, food programs for the starving millions. We are keenly involved, and many of us are involved in SALT. These are not narrow parochial interests, but we're trying to use whatever influence we might have, ability to educate the American people to things that are clearly in the national interest.
That may be, Mr. Bookbinder, but not that many of the ethnic groups use it as their prime issue. But my point is that that doesn't matter, whether it's your prime issue or whether you do it solely on one issue of relations with another country. I think the genius of this country is pluralism, in that we are all descended from somewhere, and that ethnic groups have a special interest to spend more time and effort regarding the relationships between our country and the country of where their forefathers came, whether it's Poland or here or there, no matter what. That is one of our strengths. Mr. Daley, I'll tell you a story that where my first encounter with this executive branch elitism of questioning one's loyalty and so on. As a young lawyer in the 50s, I went down and made an appointment at the State Department to talk about the Cyprus question. In the middle 50s, when hardly anyone knew anything about the Cyprus question. This is when the British were in charge and running the government with a colonial government and no legislature. And the Greek desk officer, after listening to me, said, well, now, Mr. Asides, you must remember that you're an American and not a Greek. This was sort of my first impact on experience with this. Well, that's one thing. I know.
But they don't say Greek.
Right. But when the Secretary of State of the United States in 1974, when the Greek-American community rose from the dishwasher to the PhD and said a law is being broken and bombs are dropping, and the then Secretary of State, Mr. Kissinger, said, well, it's just a Greek lobby. And now everyone says Greek lobby, not Greek Americans. So you have this problem. Number one, I say it's not only we should be involved, we have a special duty. Polish Americans are one of our greatest resources for the security of this country. We can talk all we want about missiles into Western Europe, but if the Soviets ever attack the Central Front, their greatest weakness are the Iron Country people. And the Pope did more for this country in his visit to Poland than all the diplomats have done in 30 years.
Well, let's come to grips with something else which has been mentioned. Mr. Reverend Jackson, do you think the tradition of America as a melting pot has been supplanted, and that finding the national interest as a governing factor in foreign policy is becoming increasingly difficult?
Well, I think it always was more realistic to talk about vegetable soup as an analogy than melting pot. For in reality, that is a common base. We have common interests in war and peace. We have common interests in a viable economy. We have a common interest in protecting our political system as one that we desire over against another system. And then there are matters that are ethnic priority that may be of secondary interest. And I think that law must be our foundation, and we must never confuse, it seems to me, the two. And so I think that there's been a kind of re-ethnicizing of America, particularly in the last 12 or 15 years, where there's tremendous fervor for Columbus Day and African Liberation Day and Jewish holidays and Irish holidays. And we saw this tremendous willing of pride in Polish Americans in particular, and at another level Catholic Americans when the Pope came. So I think that division, when kept in perspective, is sound. And I argue that it becomes a matter of judgment in terms of keeping it sound. I think the guiding law has to be our national interest and our national security and the obligation of our citizenship as a primary force, after which it seems to me that there's overflow into our particular interests.
Yes, Mr. Congressman.
Your question was, is finding the national interest becoming more difficult? My answer to that is clearly yes. I don't have much doubt about that. I think the issues that are before us are extraordinarily complex, much more complex than they were in another day. You're also in a day when special interests are very prominent in our political life. And I think the consensus building process in the pluralistic community or the nation has become extraordinarily difficult. The art of political leadership today is a very unenviable task. Trying to lead the House of Representatives, an enormously difficult task, to say nothing of the presidency. So I think there's just no doubt about it.
We're touching now on what I think is perhaps one of the greatest challenges facing our society, how we can blend two equally precious things. On the one hand, retaining cultural pluralism and ethnic pluralism, retaining as much of it as we can, and also ideologies of various kinds. The other thing that we have to try also to preserve and strengthen, and because it's so precious, is the common culture, the basic American system, and how we can blend these two things, define the national interest, carry it out, get consensus for it, at the same time recognizing there are differences is not easy. And I'd say to my good friends here who represent other ethnic communities, we better face a very, very real, simple fact of life. We cannot have all of our respective wishes enacted at the same time because there are conflicts among us. So we have to adjust to the fact, and I can assure you that I've adjusted to the fact. Not everything I seek on behalf of my particular group is doable.
The volume Ethnicity in U.S. Foreign Policy postulates that one of the reasons why its preliminary conclusion is that ethnic groups have not had very heavy impact upon foreign policy is that there are inter-ethnic group rivalries which have diluted that impact, and also differences that have come out of the choices and decisions which must be made within the individual ethnic groups. You had recent experience with that on your trip with the SCLC leadership and the meetings with Mr. Arafat. It has produced disagreement and divisions. Do you have any regrets that
none whatsoever, because I think that that our group, for example, is strong enough, resilient enough to differ without disintegrating. We're brothers, but we're not Siamese. and therefore, in this instance, the very controversy itself has been instructive. It has, for us, for the first time in a real sense, projected us into leading the way for new dialogue on foreign policy matters. And it is so pronounced until all of America is now being caught up in the proposition. So I feel very healthy, and feel very good about the process, because the people whose perspectives are different than ours, for example, we are still in constant dialogue. We may disagree on 2 issues out of 10, but we're still batting 800.
Mr. Daly,
yes, Mr. Rosidi.
Yes, you have your problem of within a community possibly different views, and on the other hand, you have the problem within the community. There may be the same views, but they're antagonistic within as to who's going to be a spokesman. One of the things is we've never claimed that we're the spokesman, our small little group. But I would say that to qualify the comments of the book, the effectiveness is not dampened that much by these intra-rivalries and so on. It's by the force and power and controls of the bureaucracy and its vast network of knowledge of the facts and its ability to get to the media throughout the country in 2 seconds, and a little group is trying to get a fact across.
I think a greater threat, for example, to the greater problem being created is not so much the intra-group situation, but that becomes a real danger when there becomes intergroup conflict, as we're now experiencing in terms of the black Jewish situation, where we've got far more in common as American citizens with a base of relations that we must protect. But in part, our interests beyond the shores can overextend us, and that becomes a challenge for the various leadership groups there, and even becomes a challenge for, as you will, the supreme commander or the president. In that instance, is to help try to arrest and keep balance. I think that also represents a certain kind of, Greek Jew interest, black Jew interest, that type of thing.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I agree.
Well, from what I've heard, I would assume that the inalienable right of ethnic groups to attempt to influence our foreign policy is accepted. Is there, Mr. Congressman, any essential difference, to go back to something that was raised very briefly by you, Mr. Bookbinder, any essential difference between ethnic roles in foreign policy and those, for instance, of farmers and factory workers and unions and industries who seek to restrict agricultural or footwear or textile imports? In the latter cases, certainly, in these restrictions on imports, you can affect, can you not, the foreign policy?
Well, I don't see any essential difference. I think Mr. Bookbinder made this point a little earlier. They are both groups representing a particular point of view that they want to persuade the decision makers on. They have equal rights under the law to petition the Congress. I don't see any essential difference.
I think the difference may be, Mr. Congressman, is that the ethnic influence tends to be hot-blooded, and the economic interests tend to be cold-blooded.
A little more emotional.
I think too, what's happened over the years is that people get scared and think that if what motivates your position that you're advocating is related to another country, that some careless sloganeering has given the impression that that means dual loyalty or divided loyalty. Nobody has expressed this situation better than Gerald Ford did when he was vice president. Let me read a very, very short quotation from him. He said, "Rather than question in any way those who feel deep emotional ties to other countries, whether it be Israel or Ireland or Italy or Africa, we should salute this as a manifestation of the genius of our nation. It is one of the things that make both Israel and America unique in the world." He was then talking to a group that was interested in that reference. And we ought to understand that one can continue to have emotional ties, family ties to another country, and still put the welfare of America on top.
May I have the first question, please? Which side? First question? Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Ron Walters. I'm from Howard University, and I'm a political scientist. And political scientists describe some of the tensions that are now taking place between blacks and Jews relevant to the Middle East as possibly a conflict in interest articulation. But there hasn't been much discussion here tonight about the way in which that particular tension has been exploited by third parties. As blacks, I think we suffer, as in everything else, from racism, I think, which has been the dominant response of the media and some other powerful interest groups to our attempt to participate in the Middle East. So I would like to know more about the difficulties that ethnic groups have had in attempting to exercise what is their legitimate right.
Are you addressing the question to any specific member of the panel or to the panel on bank?
Well, I think the question has wide ramifications.
Would anybody like to start on that?
Well, Reverend Jackson?
Well, I think, Dr. Walters, that starting strictly from a black point of view, as long as Dr. Du Bois was in his scholarly pursuits dealing with sociograms and arguing with Booker Washington, he was a great American scholar. The moment he started talking about Pan-Africanism, he was out of his boy box. as long as Dr. King was standing on doorsteps of bombed homes saying, black folk don't shoot white folk back, great guy, Vietnam out of his box, cut him down. I think there's some fundamental problem here once black Americans dare assert ourselves on the international scene, is that there's more focus on our intent than our content. The fundamental question is not our content, but by what authority do we speak? Where do we get the audacity from? And so we have to go through this wave of chastisement. And our concerns in the Middle East, for example, never really got through. Even to the day, what we really said. What we really said is that there are four forces that must be reconciled in our national interest. And we said it every place we went. Israel's security, Palestinian justice, Lebanon's territorial integrity, and normalized ties with the Arab world, and that our nation cannot protect its interests with a no-talk policy. That's fundamentally our position. And you've heard some of everything except that. And that's all both groups said. And both challenged both groups to stop the cycle of terrorism, break the cycle of pain so we could move to a higher level of peace. That's essentially what all of us have said.
I would like to say that these last few months have been for me and for many of my associates very, very painful because of the possible rift between the two communities. One thing I want to say absolutely clearly, if anybody suggests that the blacks don't have a right to participate in thinking through the Middle East problem, they're dead wrong. I totally repudiate that kind of comment. But two things that are parallel ought to be, I hope, acknowledged by all of us here. Number one, that when blacks or anybody else criticizes an Israeli policy, that does not make that person anti-Semitic. Right. Secondly, when Jews or other supporters of Israel come back and hit even hard on the substance of suggestions, that doesn't make that white person a racist. Let's have an honest dialogue on issues. And in that sense, I agree with Reverend Jackson. I think with all the difficulties and all the disrepair, we have now more people thinking hard about the problems out there. And I also think, with all due respect, and nobody should take offense to what I'm saying, I think those that thought they had answers, quick answers, and went out to the Middle East or elsewhere and had quick pat solutions have now learned what we learned over many years. There are difficulties, there are nuances, there are sensitivities in the Middle East thing that do not call for pat, easy solutions.
I think that what Dr. Walters is saying in part, though, is that our answers, whether pat or not pat, haven't even been heard yet. See, you don't even know why answers are pat or not pat. Nor does one really know, based upon reading the media, how recent or how long our interest has been, or what its depth is. One would not have assumed that Ralph Bunche, a black man, would have had a measure for solution at one point based upon assumptions. And at this point, all that is really coming through is assumptions about our intelligence. And then assumptions about our audacity. But our content has not yet been there. We're simply fighting essentially over a fundamental premise that we think does injury to our national security, our inability to reconcile our interests. That's our point.
Mr. Congressman.
If I understand the question properly, it was, why do some ethnic groups have difficulty impacting on the foreign policy process? And I think the answer to that is that the effort to influence foreign policy making in this country is an extraordinarily complex process. And the groups that do it successfully are highly sophisticated people. They have to be able to activate their own members, whatever members that may be, whatever group it may be. They have to have very good internal communications within the group. They have to have access to the decision makers, and they have to know who the decision makers are, and they have to have that access at the right time when the decision is being made, not months before or days afterwards. They have to have good information within the executive branch, good sources of information, both within the executive branch and within the legislative branch. They've got to be able to enlist the help of sympathetic groups There isn't any ethnic group really that's large enough to get the job done by itself. They've got to have the support of other people. And in this day and age, they've certainly got to be able to have access to the media.
Mr. Rosides?
Oh, that's one of the finest expositions, Dr. Walters, that I've heard of the problems that are involved. I would expand on the media part just as to pick a point to comment on. Foreign affairs is complex. In addition to all these things that Mr. Hamilton has mentioned, you got to break into the media. How do you do it? And again, you face this bureaucracy, the State Department and the Department of Defense. In what ways? And particularly in the Washington media. They call up their bosom buddies. They depend on the key people in the bureaucracy for their tips. And how few really will criticize the bureaucracy. We went one day to the New York Times editorial board to talk to one of the members on this issue regarding a particular editorial. And one of the editorial board members said, "Oh, but Gene, you're wrong. Henry called me this morning to tell me it's not the Turkish army, it's the importance of these listening posts for SALT verification." Well, now it turns out that those listening posts cannot be used for SALT verification. And we were at that time talking about SALT 1 verification, which was even more of a falsehood on the bureaucracy's part. So in dealing with the media, it's not just going to a newspaper man and breaking through. It's going to the newspaper man to break through. And on the other side, you've got a vast, powerful opponent. Now, we shouldn't use the word opponent. Adversary.
Lawyers like that word. We want to get as many. Yes, sir. Next question, please.
My name is Michael Newman. I'm a physician and American citizen in terms of the organization that I represent. My question is addressed to Reverend Jackson. He just now spoke about the difficulty in getting people to focus on content rather than the intent of the group, and the statements in terms of moral authority and that the guiding law should be national interest. How do you reconcile these statements with what you were reported to have said in terms of the importance of funds from the PLO and other groups flowing to your organization and the community that you represent? And if that money was not forthcoming, that the letters PLO would be deleted from the alphabet. Isn't this really a sellout in terms of national interest? And isn't this exactly the opposite of what it means to be an effective constituency here in America?
That you raised several points. First of all, the reference was not to the PLO. The PLO, from an Arab perspective, is a government in exile with full status in the Arab League, recognized by 115 nations. And because of its very nature and situation, it is unable to contribute to others. For the most part, it can't contribute to itself. It came within the context of a group of Arab business leaders and educators who were talking about how could they effectively input into the human rights movement process, just as we're talking about ethnic groups having impact upon politics and foreign affairs. And my answer was that the Jewish groups, the labor groups, and the business groups with which I have worked across the years do three things. One, they do not present themselves as foreigners. They join the organizations. They invest in them, and they project PR about their involvement and investment. And the Arab Americans, by and large, present themselves as foreigners. If they want to join the human rights process and be included on the agenda, they ought to join, invest, and then tell their story. I don't apologize about that. And I think Arab Americans ought to get involved in the human rights struggle if they're concerned about human rights. The other point I raised was that the Arab OPEC states, and I have this accumulation of monies, ought to use that money for some social good and not simply have it. That they have an obligation to invest in the African Development Bank. They have an obligation to deal with some kind of two-tiered pricing system for those underdeveloped nations less able to afford their high petroleum. So it was within that context that the statement came.
Right, next question, please. Who's got a microphone?
Somebody asked why you're looking for the next question. See, that question, when it was posed, not by you, by the writer, see, it was designed to be a catch-22 slander question. And if I had answered and said, well, we don't want Arab money, which would have been a lie. Everybody wants some of it, and everybody trying to get some of it too. That would have been one reflection. And then if I said we want some of it because it's their duty to share it, because it's the people of the world's money, so it's a catch-22 kind of answer. I just think that part of our moral authority is being forthright and honest. And you'll find that most people tend to survive.
But Reverend Jackson, this may give you an opportunity to further clarify the situation. What did trouble people at that time was the quotation which made it seem like you were making support for the Arab cause conditional upon the influx of funds. That's different from saying that you'll accept Arab funds for social causes. Then you seem to be buying or selling an advocacy, and that's not cricket.
And that's out of context, but the fact
But that was the quotation. If you want to deny it, I'd be happy to hear your denial.
Well, the fact is that is out of context, because the groups with whom we related, however casual they appear, however moral they talk, have a real strong reciprocity in those contributions, which are in fact investments. When we go to these big national conventions and we have these urban execs there with their booths there, when it comes time for a legislation argument about their company in the Congress, you see leaders start lining up, that's called chips time. That's true with all those contributions. And therefore we have this obligation to keep our investment and our integrity balanced in terms of how far we allow contributions to in fact become lobbying efforts to influence our better judgment. I mean, that's one of the real dilemmas of any politician or public officer.
But a given Middle East policy is right or wrong. It's not right or wrong depending upon whether a certain beneficiary of a policy will make it possible for you to operate.
I agree, and that's precisely why I have told those of us.
That was the impression that was clearly obtained by us as a result of the quotations which you up to this night have not yet denied.
Well, the fact is I've not had the forum with which tonight. I simply say that blacks should not be influenced by Arab money they may get or Jewish money they have gotten. We need to focus based upon a sense of conscience and an understanding of national security. And so that's my statement.
This public policy forum on the role of ethnic groups in U.S. foreign policy has been presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It has brought us the views of 4 experts in the field. It is the aim of AEI to illuminate important issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.